What's going on, everybody? Okay, this is Lady Luck here again. I have a reaction that I'm gonna do. It's not music. This is called "Facts About Slavery Never Mentioned in School" by Thomas Sowell. So we're gonna check this out, and just I got a recommendation for it, um, and plus I guess it needs to be heard and put out there, especially if it's factually correct and accurate. I have enjoyed listening to many historical videos um, in my lifetime, and so I'm big on history because we need to understand it in order to keep it from repeating itself over and over again, especially at the cost of innocent lives. So we're gonna check this out. This was sent to me as a recommendation, and it's something that's different outside of music. I've been trying to incorporate other reactions and content here on the channel, and so we're gonna do it. You guys, let me know what you think in the comment section. Hit the like button on this video. Share it with your friends, your neighbors, everyone. Also, make sure you check out the new feature YouTube has called Super Thanks. It works just like Super Chat or Super Sticker, where you can donate to your favorite YouTube content creators as well as your artists here on YouTube. It's a heart emoji with a dollar sign in the middle and the word thanks underneath it. So once you hit the like button, scroll over to the right. You may have to scroll over to the right to see that, but it's next to like the clip download feature button. It's called thanks, and that is the super thanks button, as well as my Cash App and Zelle. Other ways to donate will be in the description of this video below. Thank you guys for your love and support and for rocking with me here in the Lady Luck Club. Let's get to it.
The instrumental use of the history of slavery today also underlies the claim that slavery grew out of racism. For most of its long history, which includes most of the history of the human race, slavery was largely not the enslavement of racially different people, for the simple reason that only in recent centuries has either the technology or the wealth existed to go to another continent to get slaves and transport them en masse across an ocean. People were enslaved because they were vulnerable, not because of how they looked. The peoples of the Balkans were enslaved by fellow Europeans, as well as by the peoples of the Middle East, for at least 6 centuries before the first African was brought to the Western Hemisphere. Before the modern era, by and large, Europeans enslaved other Europeans, Asians enslaved other Asians, Africans enslaved other Africans, and the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere enslaved other indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere. Slavery.
That is a factual statement. And if you guys, I used to watch a lot of documentaries, especially about natural disasters in Pompeii in particular. If you've ever watched a documentary about Pompeii, you will know that hundreds of thousands to millions of people there on Pompeii were actual slaves, and they worked to gain their freedom. And so this is going back to 79 AD. They were able to also work and buy their freedom. Now, it is historically correct that your skin color created a different level of treatment, because even then they did have slaves from Africa, and they did still overall treat them worse than another slave who was Greek or Roman from the capital at the time. So I mean, factually it's accurate. I mean, even here in the U.S., you had a lot of people from Europe that, basically worked and served other people here in the country based on economic factors, basically unpaid labor. So slavery was a global commodity, a barter system, and unfortunately, it was for human lives in exchange for work and for the slave owners to make money. But yes, it was indigenous to the people in the same demographic area because boats didn't always exist. But once they were able to um, start creating a global demand for slavery, it did became a stigma based on your color. You know, the darker you were, the worse you were treated as a slave, the harder it was to buy your freedom. And then it just became a staple, unfortunately. So, factually, that is correct, though.
Was not based on race, much less on theories about race. Only relatively late in history did enslavement across racial lines occur on such a scale as to promote an ideology of racism that outlasted the institution of slavery itself. Wherever a separate people were enslaved, they were disdained or despised, whether they were different by country, religion, caste, race, or tribe. In East Africa, the Maasai were feared slave raiders, and other African tribes, either alone or in conjunction with Arabs, enslaved their more vulnerable neighbors. As late as 1891, it was reported that Manyuema slavers had demoralized surrounding tribes, destroying crops, and famine reigned everywhere. Even in the early 20th century, Abyssinians were still raiding other Africans and carrying off slaves. It was 1922 before the British had gained sufficient control in Tanganyika to stamp out slavery there. Arabs were the leading slave raiders in East Africa, ranging over an area larger than all of Europe. The total number of slaves exported from East Africa during the 19th century has been estimated to be at least 2 million. The form in which the story of slavery has reached most people today has been along the
Well, he said stamp out slavery, though. They didn't eradicate it. It just, the slave owners was just different in the slaves. I mean, it wasn't eradicated. I mean, apartheid was still going on in South Africa alone into the late 80s, early 90s. So it wasn't stamped out. It was just the slave owners switched, and then of course the slaves switched. It didn't just become eradicated. So
lines of the best-selling book and widely watched television miniseries Roots by Alex Haley. Challenged on the historical accuracy of Roots, Haley said, "I tried to give my people a myth to live by. This instrumental use of history, or purported history, is open to the same objections as other instrumental myth-making."
60 pounds doesn't feel like a lot until you put on a pair of sweatpants one day and they fall off.
Myth-making. Despite the impression created by Roots, during the era of the massive slave trade from West Africa, a white man was more likely to catch malaria in Africa than to catch slaves himself. The average life expectancy of a white man in the interior of sub-Saharan Africa at that time was less than 1 year. By and large, men from Europe or the Western Hemisphere came to the coasts of Africa, bought their slaves, and left as soon as possible. Even so, the death rates among the white crews of the ships carrying slaves to the Western Hemisphere were as high as the death rates among the slaves themselves. It was only much later, after quinine and other medical measures enabled Europeans to survive where there were tropical diseases, was it possible for them to invade Africa in force and establish empires there. But by then, the Atlantic slave trade had already been ended. During the era of that trade, Africa was largely ruled by Africans, who established the conditions under which slave sales took place. The crew of a slave ship was in no position to defy African rulers and their armies by going out across the land and capturing people willy-nilly. The stronger African peoples captured and enslaved the weaker peoples. The same pattern found over the centuries in Europe, Asia, the Western Hemisphere, and Polynesia. In Nyasaland, the Ngoni and Yao swaggered over and terrorized other tribes. In Uganda, the Baganda made life miserable for their neighbors. And the Nyoro and Hima of Anko enslaved Toro women and children. The Tutsi dominated the Hutu in Rwanda. The Maasai lorded it over the Kikuyu and Kamba, and the latter, in turn, held the Indorobo in a kind of serfdom. It was precisely the fact that Europeans, except for the Portuguese, seldom participated in the raids that captured and enslaved Africans that enabled most people in Europe and the Americas to remain oblivious to the traumatic experience that this was, with some Africans committing suicide to avoid capture and wives being whipped as they tried to cling to their husbands or children. Historian David Breon Davis pointed out that Europeans had little contact with the actual process of enslavement, and that, as late as 1721, the Royal African Company asked its agents to investigate the modes of enslavement in the interior. Europeans typically saw only the end results, enslaved people being offered for sale on the coast. It was much the same story in the Ottoman Empire, where those who bought slaves had no idea what these slaves had been through before. The unique position of the Western world in the history, and especially the destruction of slavery, need not imply that there was unanimity within the West on this institution. In addition to whites who defended the enslavement of Africans on racial grounds, or who opposed general emancipation on social grounds, there were many whites, and even blacks, who defended slavery as a matter of self-interest as slave owners. Although most black owners of slaves in the United States were only nominal owners of members of their own families, there were thousands of other blacks in the antebellum South who were commercial slave owners, just like their white counterparts. An estimated 1/3 of the free persons of color in New Orleans were slave owners, and thousands of these slave owners volunteered to fight for the Confederacy during the Civil War. Black slave owners were even more common in the Caribbean. In short, there were many defenders of slavery in the West, even in the 19th century. And outside the West, slavery was too widely accepted to require defense. No other nation ended slavery in the same way as the United States did, and few ended it after so short a struggle, as history is measured. How and why did slavery end in most of the world? There were two major processes. Over the centuries, as more and more territories around the world consolidated into nation-states with their own armies and navies, raiding those territories to capture and enslave the people who lived within them became more hazardous in itself, and also risked military retaliation against the countries from which the raiders came. Thus, more and more peoples became off-limits to slave raiders over time. Put differently, the areas which remained subject to slave raiding over the centuries were primarily those where the people lived in smaller or weaker societies. Such societies continued to exist where it was difficult, for geographic or other reasons.
Well, here's the thing. It was weaker because they didn't have the money flowing. It wasn't economically advanced, which hindered the advancement of many other aspects of life. I mean, they didn't have money. That means they didn't have great education. They didn't have access to medicine and health care. They barely could even own land that they were enslaved to. And that battle still persisted, especially in South Africa, for decades, going into the 20th century, where their land was still taken in descendants of slavery and of course the victims of the apartheid era. Those South Africans couldn't even keep home, keep their land to themselves. So I'm I'm all for facts to be presented, because it is a true fact that slavery was a global commodity and that slavery existed going all the way back to, era of Egyptians, and when they enslaved um, the Jewish people. Slavery has existed for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, about as long as humanity has walked this earth. But one thing we can't do is eradicate the actual reality that slavery existed in the United States to a point where it became about your race, where you were enslaved because of your race. It may not have started out that way, and it may not have originated in the United States of America, but it doesn't eliminate the fact that it did come down until it was completely eradicated, or at least abolished, because it wasn't eradicated even after that. I mean, they just transformed it into Jim Crow. You might not have been in chains, but you definitely felt constricted as a black person here in the United States, even after slavery was abolished. So it may not have originated here, and it may not have started out, the aspect of slavery didn't start out as a race issue, but it became that, unfortunately. And I don't know, they're stating information, and they're not really citing the sources on that, but I think that's a known fact that slavery was a global commodity, and that slavery did not always exist amongst people strictly because of skin color. But it did turn into that, which is unfortunate. And I don't, obviously they haven't. I mean, just the documentary on Pompeii alone and gladiators, that black gladiators were still treated far less, with harsh punishment than any other gladiator that was of Roman descent. So it's just kind of, I'm not saying this video is trying to eradicate the idea that slavery did exist at one point in history because of race, but it shouldn't be to the point where they're trying to completely change the idea that it did exist because of race. It did. It transformed and transitioned into a concept that slavery was based on your skin color. After a while, white people in the U.S., European descendants weren't considered slaves. They were probably, cooks and cleaners, they nannies, homemakers, that help take care of other white people because of the economic disadvantage. Everybody didn't come here. Immigrants that looked European did not come here rich. The U.S. is one big beautiful melting pot of people from all over the world. But Jewish people, in the 40s that came and were escaping, the horrific Nazism in European countries, they still weren't treated as bad as black people were in the 40s. So, and that's historically accurate. Historically accurate. You didn't see black people, Jewish people get lynched and had crosses burning in the front of their yards as much as you saw with black people here in the U.S. during Jim Crow. That's a fact. So, but yeah, it's the truth. It's the truth that it was a global commodity, and it's the truth that it did not start out as a racial concept, but it did end up becoming that, and it's unfortunate.
to consolidate large areas under one government. This was true of the Balkans, the backwaters of Asia, and much of sub-Saharan Africa. By the early modern era, sub-Saharan Africa, with its numerous and severe geographic handicaps, was one of the last remaining areas from which vast numbers of people could be enslaved.
So that was the full video. I encourage you guys to definitely read the information that they did provide and the references they provided. They quoted a book in the beginning with black rednecks, white liberals. So I encourage you all to do your research and to look up information about history. It's unfortunate that lots of factual information about slavery does not get covered in school. And have laws they're trying to implement now in this era where they're just trying to eliminate the idea, the concept of slavery in general. It existed. You can't change what actually happened in history. It's just the reality of what happened, not just in the U.S., but all over the world. You cannot erase the fact that it occurred. And you certainly can't erase the fact that it occurred in the U.S. and did transpire into, a racial issue when it came to slavery. You can't eradicate. You can't eradicate the fact that even after slavery was abolished in the United States, that black people still had to deal with the remnants of that, and then had to suffer through Jim Crow and civil rights. You can't erase those, just like the women's movement and women suffrage movements and women being able to vote. Those are just historical events that happened, and you can't erase it. You can't erase it. Whether it shines well or positively on slave owners or not, you can't erase the fact that it occurred. So, slavery, no, it was not a construct that was built on race, because you didn't have a way to exchange people across countries and nations. But over time, as there were advancements in the trade system, countries reaching out to each other for goods and services, slavery became one of those things, and unfortunately it did evolve into this horrific image of where it was stemmed on your race and not just your socioeconomic disadvantage. So let's keep all of that in perspective. And like I said, you guys, please make sure you read about your history, get some great historical context, documentation, references, sources. I think the best way to also spread the truth is to talk about what happened through the generations. What did your great grandmothers and grandfathers have to endure. Because you can't, like I said, you can't take away the reality of what people experience. It's not going anywhere. So, but I think that, in all that getting, get some understanding, get some knowledge, and learn from your experience. And it has a way of being a great teacher experience. And that's the reality of black people, not just in the U.S., but all over the world, that many black people were enslaved. Whether it was by other black people or Europeans or whomever, it was just, it's part of the history of black people as well as other races. And it's unfortunate that it did divulge into an issue of race. So you guys continue to stay safe. And all that, get some understanding. And take care of yourselves, take care of each other. And until the next video.